Christian year. We're skipping on through it at the moment, as we always do. But I was looking at sort of the pattern of it, the overall shape of it yesterday. You sort of realise after a while it's actually quite erratic. I mean, some parts of the Christian year, some parts of the times that we remember are very true to the times that they remember. There are 40 days from Easter to Ascension Day, just as there were 40 days from Jesus' resurrection to his ascension into heaven. Likewise, Palm Sunday is a week before Easter, just as Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem was about a week before his resurrection. However, much of the narrative of the 30-year life and ministry of Jesus is crammed into the 3 or 4 months of the year from Christmas to Easter. Even allowing that there are lengthy gaps in the narrative, from when his family settled in Nazareth, probably when he was around about a toddler, to when his family visited the temple, about 10 years later, and then another 15 to 20 years till the start of his ministry. This means that the 3+ years, plus the bits, come hot on the heels of each other at the start of the year. And then we have about over 6 months of ordinary time after Ascension until Remembrance Tide, and Advent come round again. So since Christmas, we've had Epiphany. And this is a time when we remember several key events in the earthly life of Jesus, including his baptism by John the Baptist when Jesus was about 30, and his presentation in the temple and the prophecy of Simeon when Jesus was probably about 40 days old. Though conspicuously, we mark the latter after the former. Anyway, today is the last Sunday before we start the countdown to Easter through Lent. And helpfully, we call this the Sunday next before Lent. So, we're right on the cusp of Lent. We're presented with arguably the greatest miracle from Jesus' earthly life, and the only one during his life to involve himself, his transfiguration. And there are 3 questions that I want to sort of look at today. What happened? What does it mean? And the third one, which better just make sure we get there, did it really happen? And what's the point of it if it did, and whatever? So those are the sort of 3 broad points I want to look at. So we'll start off with what happened. Now I think this is both the easy bit and in some ways the most incredible. I mean, Jesus took 3 of his closest disciples up a high mountain. Traditionally it's Mount Tabor, but maybe it was Mount Hermon. Apparently it's taller and closer to Caesarea Philippi, which is where everything else that happened right about that time happened. But anyway, wherever it was, he went up a high mountain and he was transfigured. Now, there's no suggestion that this was something which changed him internally or spiritually per se. He was born fully human and fully God by the virgin birth. He had been baptized by John when the Spirit descended as a dove, and God had spoken in a way which was audible to Jesus and to the crowd. The transformation in this case, as far as it's related to us, was physical, as his face shone and his clothes became white as light. And then Moses and Elijah appeared. Now, there isn't any discussion in this passage about why anyone knew who they were, but nonetheless, Moses and Elijah appeared, and they spoke with Jesus. And then Peter, and it is always Peter, isn't it? But Peter suggests that he put up some tents for the 3 of them. But even as he's saying it, a bright cloud covers them, and a voice affirms who Jesus is, which utterly terrifies the disciples, who fall to the ground. However, Jesus reassures them, and when they look up, they are alone with Jesus, who tells them on the way down not to tell anyone until after his resurrection. So, that's basically what happened. As I said, that's the easy bit, and also it's the rather incredible bit. But what does it mean? First of all, whenever we look at a scripture, I think it's worth looking at the surrounding passages, see what the context is. By this point in his ministry, Jesus has really incurred the wrath of the religious establishment. Obviously, that was what ultimately led to his death, but he's well on his way by this stage. In chapter 15 of Matthew, the Pharisees and teachers of the law have tried to discredit him by asking why his disciples don't wash their hands before eating, as is traditional. Jesus has immediately pointed out their hypocrisy. All his disciples deviate from is mere tradition, whilst the religious teachers have established a tradition which directly contradicts God's law. He quotes Isaiah. "These people honour me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. And he goes on and tells them that Isaiah was speaking about them. And then in the next chapter, chapter 16, they're back and they're demanding a sign from heaven to prove who he, Jesus, is. And Jesus responds by calling them a wicked and adulterous generation, and later warns the disciples to be on their guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. The yeast, that organism that a small amount can just spread everywhere and infect everything. And then Jesus quizzes his disciples as to who people are saying he is. And their replies show that there is great speculation, including the recently beheaded John the Baptist, and various great prophets and men of faith, including Elijah and Jeremiah. And often when things were getting really hectic and busy and maybe sort of closing in on him, Jesus would go away to a quiet place, sometimes by himself, sometimes with the disciples. And apparently in response to all this feverish activity and speculation, Jesus takes his 3 closest disciples up a mountain. And a voice, reminiscent of the voice which affirmed him at his baptism at the very start of his ministry, says, "This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Now, clearly, this was the ultimate answer to the question which everyone was asking. This voice, this series of events, was clearly the answer to that question. Now, I remember when I was a young Christian, I remember hearing the myth that Jesus never actually claims to be God or the Christ. And in one sense, this is, of course, true. Nowhere in the Bible do you see the words recorded by Jesus, "I am God" or "I am the Christ." But a fair-minded reading of the Gospels leaves very little room for doubt regarding Jesus' claims for himself. 2 obvious examples. In Matthew 16, Peter says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now, Jesus would have been quite happy to rebuke him. He did it often enough. But he doesn't. He rather says that Peter must have had that revealed to him by my Father in heaven. And then much later in Matthew 26, after Jesus' arrest when he's being tried by the Sanhedrin, Jesus refuses to answer any of their distorted and trumped-up charges. But eventually, in desperation and completely against the rules of the court, the high priest says, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Now, this was completely against the rules, because it was entirely up to the prosecution to prove their charge, which they had utterly failed to do. And the accused was not required to speak. But the phrase, "I charge you under oath by the living God," required any Jew to answer what followed. And Jesus' reply to Jewish ears was equally unambiguous. Because while to us the phrase, "You have said so," is almost like, "Yeah, whatever," actually, at that time, "You have said so" was a totally emphatic yes. Clearly, Jesus believed himself to be the Messiah, the Christ. And this fact leaves us with a stark choice. Famously, the great Christian author and apologist C.S. Lewis pointed out that by saying such things, Jesus had totally ruled out the option that he was merely a great man, a wise prophet or teacher. His claims were so outlandish and called for such self-sacrifice from his followers that he must be who he claimed to be, or utterly deluded, or a really evil person. For if he's not the Messiah, he's either the biggest liar or the most deluded fool to have ever lived. There isn't a fourth option. So, everyone's been speculating about who Jesus is. Jesus has affirmed Peter when he's declared him to be the Messiah. And Jesus and his 3 closest disciples have met Moses and Elijah up a high mountain. Now, Moses, of course, had met with God on top of a high mountain himself. And after being in God's presence, his face had shone. I think there are 2 clues to the meaning of this passage here. See, after meeting with God, Moses' face had shone. But during the Transfiguration, we only see recorded that Jesus' face and entire being had shone. Not the disciples, not Moses and Elijah, but Jesus. Moses, when he met with God, his face had shone. During the Transfiguration, Jesus' whole being had. Perhaps here, the disciples saw a glimpse of the glory, not actually the glory of God per se, the glory of Jesus the Son. The glory of God, yes, but the glory of Jesus the Son, Jesus' own glory. They saw a glimpse of it in that moment. And of course, as the conduit of the law from God to the Jewish people, Moses was the ultimate symbol of the law. If you want to think of it in these terms, Moses was the Mr. Law for the Jewish people. If you wanted to think about the law, if you wanted a symbol for the law, it was Moses. And meanwhile, Elijah was one of the ultimate prophets for the Jewish people. Indeed, one of the later prophecies of the Old Testament times, Malachi, so it's about 400, 500 years BC, in Malachi says that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes. So, here we have Mr. Law, Moses, and Mr. Prophet, Elijah, who's been prophesied must return before the Messiah will be fulfilled. On top of the mountain with Jesus, whose whole body is shining like Moses' face did after meeting with God, and a voice says, "This is my son whom I love, with him I am well pleased, listen to him." Not listen to them, but listen to him. And when Jesus reassures the disciples, they find that Moses and Elijah even, have gone. Earlier in Matthew 5, Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So, Elijah has returned to fulfill the prophecy regarding the coming of the Messiah. The voices affirm Jesus not only as his son, but also that the disciples should listen to him, as he is the fulfillment of all that Moses and Elijah symbolized, the law and the prophets. Jesus is the fulfillment of them. It's not that he's done away with them, he has actually superseded them, he has fulfilled them. And now his disciples should not listen to the law, to the prophets, they should listen to Jesus because he is the fulfillment of both. And the disciples now left alone, just with that fulfillment, just with Jesus. For he is the fulfillment not just of the prophecies regarding the Messiah, but the fulfillment of all the law and the prophets. You might be able to guess my answer to this question here, did it really happen? I think I'm likely to go around the houses and come to the conclusion it did, but just bear with me a moment. Sometimes we talk about our spiritual lives being a series of mountaintop and valley experiences. It's easy to feel in the valley that this is the whole reality of our spiritual life. But God gives us the mountaintops to remember when we're going through the hard times. Psalm 23 famously says, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." And it's good to remember that, but it can also be hard to remember that at those times. After Jesus and the disciples' ultimate mountaintop experience, they all suffered some terrible valley experiences. Jesus, of course, suffered terrible torture and execution. Peter soon denied Jesus, although was subsequently restored, and ultimately crucified too. James was executed. Only John is believed to have died a natural death, but of course he had a long life with many different highs and lows through it. He took responsibility for Jesus' mother after the crucifixion, and so on. So often it's tempting to think of our mountaintop experiences in retrospect as being merely adrenaline and excitement, but to view our valley experiences as a spiritual reality. But God wants us to remember our mountaintops to sustain us and illuminate us in our understanding of our valleys. And Peter's experience on top of that mountain, he puts to good use in our second reading this morning. For the power of the gospel isn't that it was cleverly devised by people in order to convince or compel, but that it was the simple truth as witnessed by people, but devised by God. For here Peter, many years later, says simply that he knows who Jesus was and is, because he saw and heard it spelt out on top of the mountain. He saw, he heard, he witnessed. But more than that, Peter points out that Jesus was the clear fulfillment of the prophecies of the Messiah. We've touched on one today, the return of Elijah. But Jesus, I don't claim to have checked this myself, but I read, Jesus is the fulfillment of at least 332 distinct Old Testament prophecies. Now, somebody took the trouble to calculate the odds of one man by chance fulfilling 8 of these prophecies. I don't know how you say that number, but it's a 1 followed by 17 zeros. Whilst the chance of fulfilling 48 of the 332 apparently is that. Don't worry to count them, there's 157 of them, those zeros there. So, here we have a man who's fulfilled all 332 of them. You know, what can we take from this? I think we can have great certainty that it actually happened. An industry has developed in the last 150 years to pick apart the Gospels to try and identify the historical and the embellished elements of the life of Jesus. But the Transfiguration not only appears in all 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, excuse me, but it's wonderfully attested to in its entirely independent letter from Peter to the early church. In the Gospel, he's said to have been there. In the letter, he says he witnessed it. And the words which were spoken are almost identical, which we would expect for such a momentous moment. Secondly, this thing of what's the point for us? Firstly, I think it's a clear message to us confirming who Jesus was, is, and will continue to be. That he is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, is the Son of God, is the Messiah. Basically, that what he says of himself is true, as attested by the presence of Moses and Elijah and the voice from heaven. Secondly, I think we can take from this that our mountaintop experiences often give us the resources to survive and learn from our times in the valley. They provide us with great insight and teaching for our times later. Peter was able to use it marvellously. And lastly, God calls us to be witnesses to others of what we see and hear and of what we know. Now, Peter wrote to the early church assuring them that he had witnessed these momentous things. But he also spoke of what had been prophesied. You see, each confirmed the other. Peter's witness was that the events had happened in his sight and hearing. The prophecies show that God was behind the events which fulfilled them. The two worked together. There is much we know because we have the Bible. We should study it and be prepared to show how Jesus is the one who was prophesied. But God also reveals himself to each of us at different times, sometimes on the mountaintop, sometimes in other ways. These experiences and revelations we can use to sustain ourselves when doubt and troubles arise. But, maybe as importantly, they are also a powerful testimony, which we can use to build up and encourage each other. We should know our Bibles. We should know the prophecies. We should know the fulfillment of them. We should be able to use them to say, this is God's work at hand. This is what God has done. And we should also treasure those insights that God gives us at different times, both for ourselves and as a witness to what God is continuing to do in this world today.